My name is David Martinez. I'm 28 years old, and when I accepted the call to pastor the abandoned Riverside Community Church in Cedar Falls, Tennessee, I thought I was getting a chance to rebuild something beautiful. The small town of 3,000 people had been without a pastor for over 20 years, ever since Pastor Thomas Williams mysteriously disappeared in 2002. The church board, led by Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, a stern woman in her 70s, had been surprisingly eager to hand over the keys. "Just focus on bringing people back to God, Pastor Martinez," she had said with a tight smile. "Don't worry about the past. Some stones are better left unturned." But as I stood in the dusty sanctuary that first morning in March, sunlight streaming through cracked stained glass windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The pews were covered in white sheets like ghosts, and an eerie silence hung in the air despite the chirping birds outside. I had moved to Cedar Falls with my wife Maria and our 6-year-old daughter Sophia, hoping for a fresh start after struggling to find my place in ministry. The salary was modest, but the church came with a small parsonage and the promise of a community hungry for spiritual renewal. What I didn't expect was the wall of silence that greeted every mention of Pastor Williams. When I asked about him at the local diner, conversations stopped. When I brought him up at the first board meeting, the members exchanged uncomfortable glances. "He just left one day," explained Harold Morrison, the church treasurer, avoiding my eyes. "Packed up and disappeared. Happens sometimes with pastors, you know. The pressure gets to them." But something about their story didn't add up. Why would a beloved pastor, who had supposedly served faithfully for 15 years, just vanish without a word? And why did everyone seem so nervous when I mentioned wanting to honor his memory? The answer began to reveal itself 3 weeks later, when I decided to clean out the old pastor's study. The study had been locked since 2002, according to Mrs. Blackwood. "We sealed it up out of respect," she explained, reluctantly handing me an old brass key. "But I suppose you'll need the space." As I turned the key and pushed open the heavy wooden door, the smell of old books and dust filled my nostrils. The room was exactly as Pastor Williams had left it. A cup of coffee sat on the desk, now covered in a thick layer of dust, and an open Bible lay beside it, turned to Psalm 23. But it was what I found hidden behind a loose floorboard that changed everything. I had been moving the heavy oak desk when I noticed the floorboard beneath it was slightly raised. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pried it up with a letter opener. Inside the hidden compartment were 3 items that made my blood run cold: Pastor Williams' personal Bible, his gold pocket watch engraved with "To Thomas, with love, Rebecca 1987, and a sealed envelope marked, "For whoever finds this, the truth about Riverside Church." My hands trembled as I opened the envelope and began to read the handwritten letter inside. "If you're reading this, something has happened to me. I've discovered something terrible about the people I trusted most, and I fear for my life. The church board has been stealing from our congregation for years, using the building fund and mission donations to line their own pockets. But that's not the worst part. They've been laundering money for Jimmy Castellano's gambling operation, using our church as a front." The letter went on to detail how Pastor Williams had stumbled upon the scheme when he noticed discrepancies in the church finances. He had been quietly gathering evidence, photographing documents, and recording conversations. He planned to expose everything to the authorities, but feared the board would stop him. "I'm hiding this evidence in the church basement, behind the old furnace. If something happens to me, please make sure the truth comes out. The people of Cedar Falls deserve to know what kind of wolves have been leading their sheep." Pastor Thomas Williams, October 15, 2002. I sat back in the dusty chair, my mind reeling. Pastor Williams hadn't abandoned his congregation. He had been trying to protect them. And now, 21 years later, I held the key to solving his disappearance. But as I looked out the study window and saw Harold Morrison's car pulling into the church parking lot, I realized I might be in the same danger that had claimed my predecessor. I quickly hid the Bible, watch, and letter in my jacket before Harold knocked on the study door. His usually friendly demeanor seemed forced as he peered around the room. "Finding everything you need, Pastor?" he asked, his eyes scanning the disturbed desk area. "Just getting familiar with the space," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Pastor Williams certainly had a lot of books. Harold's jaw tightened at the mention of the name. "Yes, well, book learning isn't everything. Sometimes a man can get too curious for his own good." The warning in his voice was unmistakable. Over the next few days, I felt eyes watching me everywhere I went. Mrs. Blackwood began showing up at the church unannounced, asking pointed questions about what I was doing in the study. Board member Frank DeLuca, who owned the town's only construction company, made comments about how the old church was dangerous, and maybe I should be careful walking around alone. When I mentioned to Maria that I wanted to explore the church basement, she grabbed my arm with concern. "David, something's not right in this town. Sophia told me that Mrs. Peterson next door warned her to tell her daddy to stop asking questions about the old pastor." But I couldn't let it go. That weekend, while Maria and Sophia visited her sister in Nashville, I returned to the church with a flashlight and crowbar. The basement entrance was behind the sanctuary, down a narrow stone stairway that led into darkness. The basement was larger than I expected, filled with old church supplies, broken pews, and a massive coal furnace that hadn't been used in decades. Following Pastor Williams' directions, I made my way to the back corner where the old furnace stood like a rusted monument. Behind it, I found a loose stone in the foundation wall. Inside the hidden space was a waterproof box containing dozens of photographs, financial documents, and audio cassette tapes. The evidence was overwhelming: bank deposits that didn't match church records, photos of board members meeting with known criminals, and recordings of conversations discussing the pastor problem. One recording made my blood freeze. It was Mrs. Blackwood's voice, cold and calculating. "Thomas is getting too close. Jimmy says we need to handle this permanently. Make it look like he just left town, but make sure he can never come back to cause trouble." Harold Morrison's voice responded, "What about his things? People will ask questions. We'll say he packed light. People disappear all the time. And if anyone gets too curious..." The recording cut off there, but the implication was clear. I had found evidence of not just embezzlement and money laundering, but conspiracy to commit murder. Pastor Williams hadn't left Cedar Falls. He had been killed to protect the board's criminal enterprise. As I climbed back up the basement stairs, my heart pounding with the weight of the truth, I didn't notice the figure waiting for me in the shadows of the sanctuary. "Find what you were looking for, Pastor Martinez." I spun around to find Frank DeLuca standing near the pulpit, his massive frame silhouetted against the moonlight streaming through the windows. He wasn't alone. Harold Morrison and two other men I didn't recognize flanked him on either side. "Just checking on some church maintenance issues," I said, trying to sound casual while gripping the evidence box tightly. Frank laughed, a sound that echoed ominously in the empty church. "You know, we had the same problem with Pastor Williams. Good man, but too curious for his own good. Always poking around where he didn't belong." "What happened to him?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Harold stepped forward, his face grim. Thomas was going to destroy this church with his accusations. He was going to tear apart families, ruin reputations, all over some bookkeeping errors. Bookkeeping errors? I couldn't hide my disgust. "You were stealing from widows and orphans. You were laundering money for criminals. We were surviving, Mrs." Blackwood's voice cut through the darkness as she emerged from behind the altar. Even in her 70s, She moved with predatory grace. This town was dying, Pastor. The mine closed, the young people left, and the church was going bankrupt. We did what we had to do to keep the lights on. By selling your souls, I replied. Her eyes flashed with anger. Thomas said the same self-righteous garbage, right up until the end. Where is he? I demanded. What did you do with Pastor Williams? Frank cracked his knuckles. Same thing we're going to do with you unless you're smarter than he was. You can walk away from this church, take your family, and never come back. Or you can join Thomas in his eternal rest. The threat was clear, but I thought of Pastor Williams' letter, of his faith in God's justice, and of the congregation that deserved to know the truth. I couldn't let his sacrifice be in vain. The evidence is already copied and hidden. I lied, hoping to buy time. If anything happens to me, it goes to the state police. Mrs. Blackwood's composure cracked for the first time. You're bluffing. Try me. For a tense moment, we stared at each other across the sanctuary where countless souls had sought salvation. Then Harold pulled out his phone and made a call. Jimmy, we have a problem at the church. Yeah, another one like before. How do you want us to handle it? As I listened to Harold's half of the conversation, I realized I had walked into the same trap that had claimed Pastor Williams. But unlike my predecessor, I wasn't alone. Before coming to the church that night, I had called someone who could help, and I prayed they would arrive in time. Just as Frank DeLuca started moving toward me, the church doors burst open and Deputy Sheriff Janet Collins rushed in with her weapon drawn, followed by 2 state police detectives. Cedar Falls Police. Nobody move. The board members froze, caught red-handed in their intimidation. But Mrs. Blackwood recovered quickly, her politician's instincts kicking in. Officers, thank goodness you're here, she said, switching to her sweet grandmother voice. Pastor Martinez has been acting erratically, making wild accusations against our church board. We were just trying to talk some sense into him. Is that why you brought armed backup? Deputy Collins asked, nodding toward one of Frank's associates who was clearly carrying a concealed weapon. Now, Janet, Harold said, trying his folksy charm. You know us, we're God-fearing people. There's been some misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, I said, holding up the evidence box, is how you thought you could get away with murder. Detective Sarah Chun, one of the state investigators, stepped forward. We're going to need to see what's in that box, Pastor Martinez. As I handed over Pastor Williams' hidden evidence, Mrs. Blackwood's mask finally slipped completely. You have no idea what you're dealing with, she snarled. Jimmy Castellano doesn't leave loose ends. You mean the Jimmy Castellano who was arrested 3 hours ago in Memphis? Detective Chin asked with a smile. Along with most of his organization? We've been building a case against his money laundering operation for 2 years. Your church was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The color drained from Harold's face. That's impossible. Jimmy said a lot of things, Detective Chin interrupted. Most of them lies. Did you really think you could trust a career criminal to protect you? Frank DeLuca tried to make a run for it, but Deputy Collins was faster. As she tackled him near the altar, his phone skittered across the floor, and we could all hear a voice on the other end. Frank? Frank, the cops got Jimmy. Clean up the church mess and disappear. Frank. Mrs. Blackwood closed her eyes in defeat. Thomas always said the truth would come to light. I guess even dead pastors have the last laugh. Where's Pastor Williams? I demanded. His family deserves to know. For a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. Then, perhaps feeling the weight of judgment in that sacred space, she pointed toward the church cemetery. Behind the old oak tree. Harold and Frank, they made it look like an unmarked grave. Said he was just a drifter who died in winter. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Mrs. Blackwood looked at me with something that might have been respect. You know, if you just minded your own business, you could have lived a long, quiet life here. That's not the kind of life Pastor Williams lived, I replied. And it's not the kind of life God calls us to. The arrests of the Riverside Church Board members made headlines across Tennessee. Within days, investigators had unraveled a conspiracy that reached far beyond our small town. Jimmy Castellano's gambling and money laundering operation had corrupted officials in 3 counties, with the church serving as just one of many fronts for illegal activities. Pastor Thomas Williams' body was found exactly where Mrs. Blackwood had indicated, buried in an unmarked grave behind the old oak tree that had shaded the church cemetery for over 100 years. The medical examiner confirmed he had been murdered, struck down while trying to protect his congregation from those who claimed to serve alongside him. Harold Morrison, facing life in prison, quickly turned state's evidence and provided detailed testimony about how the conspiracy had operated. The church's building fund, money donated by hard-working families to expand their sanctuary, had been systematically stolen over nearly a decade. Mission funds meant to help impoverished communities overseas had instead lined the pockets of criminals. Frank DeLuca's construction company had been the perfect cover for the money laundering scheme. Fake renovation projects at the church and other properties allowed them to funnel dirty money into legitimate-looking contracts. When Pastor Williams had started asking questions about why the building projects never seemed to make progress despite the constant flow of donations, he had signed his own death warrant. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, the woman who had controlled the church board for over 30 years, had been the mastermind behind it all. Her sweet grandmother facade had hidden a calculating criminal mind that had no qualms about ordering murder to protect her illegal empire. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and I testified about finding Pastor Williams' evidence and the threats made against me. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Mrs. Blackwood received life in prison without parole for conspiracy to commit murder. Harold got 25 years for embezzlement and accessory to murder. Frank DeLuca received life plus 30 years for murder and racketeering. But the most important moment came when Pastor Williams' sister, Rebecca, traveled from Ohio to attend the sentencing. She was the same Rebecca who had given him the pocket watch I'd found, his wife, who had died young from cancer, leaving him to serve God alone. Thomas always believed that truth and justice would prevail, she told the court through tears. He gave his life protecting people who never even knew they were in danger. Today, his sacrifice finally means something. 6 months after the trials ended, Riverside Community Church held its first service in over 20 years. The pews, no longer covered in ghostly sheets, were filled with people from across Cedar Falls who had come to remember Pastor Williams and celebrate a new beginning. We had used the recovered stolen money to completely renovate the church, honoring Pastor Williams' original vision for expansion and community service. The new fellowship hall was named the Thomas Williams Center for Truth and Justice, and his pocket watch was displayed in a place of honor near the altar. Maria and I decided to stay in Cedar Falls, despite offers from larger churches in bigger cities. This community needed healing, and God had called us to be part of that process. Sophia, now 7, loved playing in the cemetery among the old headstones. No longer a place of hidden secrets, but a peaceful reminder of those who had passed on. We established the Pastor Williams Memorial Fund to help other small churches facing financial difficulties, ensuring that what happened in Cedar Falls could never happen again. The fund also supports families of whistleblowers who risk everything to expose corruption in religious organizations. Deputy Sheriff Janet Collins was promoted to sheriff and became one of our most active church members. Seeing how faith and courage work together to bring justice, she told me, that restored something in me I thought I'd lost. Even some of the conspiracy members' families found their way back to church. Harold Morrison's daughter brought her children to Sunday school, seeking redemption for her father's sins and a fresh start for her family. But perhaps the most meaningful change came in my own heart. I had arrived in Cedar Falls as a struggling young pastor, unsure of my calling and questioning whether I had what it took to serve God effectively. Through the crucible of confronting evil and fighting for justice, I discovered that faith isn't just about comfort and peace. Sometimes it's about courage and confrontation. Every Sunday, as I stand behind the pulpit where Pastor Williams once preached, I remember his words from that letter. The people of Cedar Falls deserve to know what kind of wolves have been leading their sheep. His sacrifice taught me that a true shepherd doesn't just feed the flock. Sometimes he has to protect them from predators even when it costs everything. The old oak tree behind the church now bears a bronze plaque honoring Pastor Thomas Williams. He gave his life for truth, and truth set his people free. Beneath it, where his unmarked grave once lay hidden, grows a beautiful garden tended by church volunteers. On quiet evenings, when I walk through that garden, I sometimes feel his presence, not as a ghost haunting the church, but as a faithful servant whose work was finally completed. The truth he died to protect had indeed come to light, bringing justice to the guilty and peace to the innocent. Cedar Falls learned that faith and justice are not enemies but allies, and that sometimes God calls ordinary people to do extraordinary things in his name. Pastor Williams' story reminds us all that no matter how long evil may seem to triumph, truth has a way of rising from the grave, bringing redemption to those who seek it. His watch still ticks in its display case, marking time until that day when all secrets are revealed and perfect justice reigns. Until then, his church continues his work, serving the community, protecting the vulnerable, and always seeking the truth that sets us free.